This is a reading I have to do for a class that I'm taking in fall 2023. So I'm not doing the entire book. I'm just reading the introductory essay, and it's by Marylin Butler in the book Burke, Payne, Godwin, and the Revolutionary Controversy. Uh, the class is about England during the Industrial Revolution. So if you're interested or are in the class with me, you can listen to this or, I don't know, listen to something else. All right, I'm going to get started. Introductory essay. This book selects from the pamphlet war of the 1790s. As a public issue, the quote revolution end quote debate lasted for about 6 years, from the first English rejoicings at France's new dawn in 1789 to December 1795, when Pitt's government introduced measures to stop the spread of radicalism by the printed and spoken word. But the question in contention cannot be understood except in a longer perspective. When the dispute opens, the combatants are speaking of a revolution that is Britain's, not France's, the glorious revolution of the 17th century. At the close, they are no longer writing of political revolution as imminent or practicable. Yet the themes and techniques of the 1790s do not disappear but go underground to reemerge in at least two distinct areas of 19th century controversy: the working class radical movement and its press of the post-Napoleonic era, and the more specialized, refined, sometimes notionally radical body of literature known as the Romantic movement. For many of those who afterwards played a part in the 19th century controversy, the course taken by the Revolution debate was significant, even formative. In 1790, Burke, in his Reflections on the Revolution in France, set out to rally English sentiment and patriotism in support of the existing aristocratic system of government. During the next 3 years, scores of radical writers, among whom Payne and Godwin, are the most powerful, replied with critiques of monarchy and aristocracy, and with alternative proposals which included republicanism, agrarian socialism, and anarchy. Alfred Cockburn calls the debate, quote, perhaps the last real discussion of the fundamentals of politics in this country. Issues as great have been raised in our day, but it cannot be pretended that they have evoked a political discussion on the intellectual level of that inspired by the French Revolution, end quote. The effect is not that of a protracted university seminar dedicated to studying events overseas. Discussion centers instead on British society, what it is like and what it ought to be like, rather than limiting themselves, as modern academics often have them do, to theories such as, quote, natural rights, end quote. The participants are putting pressure on those in power, on behalf of those who would like more of it, and in 1792 at least, the word, quote, revolution, end quote, comes to have a meaning that is close to home and practical. Should Britain continue to be governed by owners of land? Why do so few own land? Even why need individuals own land at all? Nowadays, we lack commonly accepted rules for reading books like Burke's Reflections, Payne's Rights of Man, Wollstonecraft's Rights of Woman, or Godwin's Political Justice. A philosopher sees Godwin in Political Justice, grappling with, quote, perennial problems, government and human progress, the power of truth and the nature of man, friendship and obligation, marriage, sex, population, end quote. A historian is concerned with its influence, which he notes, quote, was confined to a small and highly literate circle, end quote. Literary critics usually regard political justice as peripheral to their subject, perhaps of most interest because some greater writer, Wordsworth or Shelley, had to reject it before arriving at the more subjective irrationalist theories appropriate to poets. If the philosophers and the literary critic collaborated, their account of the book's meaning would be enriched by the need to relate its, quote, perennial, end quote, matter to its method and manner, the text's subliminal ploys to win the reader's agreement. If either would consider the circumstances of the book's production, too often the concern of only the historian, they would see an unstable but more fascinating work, its matter and manner responding to the events of 1790 to 1795, changing even in its relationship to Burke's reflections. Study of the Revolution controversy as a whole reveals the artificiality of the practice, common among philosophers and critics, of examining an isolated book out of its context. The Revolution debate represents in its totality not discrete text and not the oeuvres of autonomous authors, but a single series of works which depend for their meaning upon one another, upon the historical situation which gave them birth, and upon the different kinds of reader for whom they were designed. Perhaps 2/3 of the words in this book emerged from a community of writers, personally known to one another, stimulating and sustaining one another, at first especially the writer-readers of a shared project. This collective literary enterprise and its breakup presents the critic with a phenomenon of great methodological interest as well as historical importance. It is so clearly focused upon a single complex issue and so consciously a genuinely interactive debate that a special approach that has been adopted here and the principles of selection look rather different from those of other volumes in the present series. As usual, the main texts, which here are those of Burke, Paine, and Godwin, are given at length, but on this occasion they are accompanied by a large number of shorter extracts from other authors, including a group who carry the story from Paine and the theorist of popular language to Wordsworth. The reader can follow the successive phases of the debate and observe how each writer responds to his predecessors, to his public, and to a European crisis of unique fascination and significance. English radicalism encountered a severe setback in the mid-1790s, the end of all hopes of any substantial reform legislation for well over a generation. In 1790, however, the mood on the radical side was unusually cheerful. Between 1760 and 1790, there had been a series of extra-parliamentary campaigns aimed at extending the franchise further or much further down the social scale, and at redrawing the parliamentary boundaries so that the new conurbations of the Midlands and the North, notably Leeds, Sheffield, Manchester, and Birmingham, were represented. The lobbying was done either by associations hitherto run by liberal-minded gentlemen or in books, newspapers, and pamphlets. The era sees a spate of liberal writings on the Constitution, important for our purposes because it is the quote, story so far, end quote, behind the radical pamphlets of the 1790s. We think of English 18th century government as stable and broadly successful in achieving its ends, but the critique of the system was also strong, deeply rooted and articulate, so that by the last half of the century its disparate strands had merged into what was in effect an alternative ideology. A Whig oligarchy governed with the support of city interests, capital C city interests, controlling Parliament through its network of personal contacts and its monopoly of patronage, and maintaining an expansive, competitive, and often aggressive foreign policy in the interests of British trade. The system's natural opponents among the politicized classes included, especially early in the century, elements of the old Tory country gentlemen and of the urban old Whigs or radicals, all of whom looked back within their respective intellectual traditions to the fierce doctrinaire disputes of the 17th century. By the second half of the 18th century, this opposition was generating a powerful rhetoric, heady enough to sustain the American Revolution, vague enough to manifest itself ubiquitously in the arts, for in the poetry and painting of 1770 to 1800, salient themes include a sense of personal liberty and autonomy, a belief in civic virtue, and a hatred of corruption, all of which can be seen as symptomatic of a, quote, Republican, end quote, tradition in Western European thought, at least as old as Machiavelli. When he applies himself more specifically to the Constitution, the late 18th century radical seeks to extend the democratic element in the system, which is notionally held to be a balance between monarch, aristocracy, and commons. Typically, then, the radical criticizes the monarch or the aristocracy or both, and represents these institutions as encroaching upon the populace or upon its preserve, the House of Commons. He sees existing government as not truly tripartite, but aristocratic. He therefore argues for economical reform because he believes that an oligarchic government maintains its influence through its control of patronage, or that it manipulates the economy in favor of its own small class. The quote, landed interest, end quote. The radical opposes war because, again, he thinks wars tend to profit certain wealthy interests, like the aristocratic owners of West Indian plantations, while they entail loss to ordinary commerce and hardship to the population at large. This is the common currency of radical writing at almost any point in the closing decades of the century, as familiar to the literary reader from the poetry of Cowper or Blake as to the historian from newspapers and parliamentary speeches. But though the principles are much repeated, the ideas evolved during the 1770s and 1780s, becoming larger and more insistently radical. Arguably, the ideas and the language in which they are couched begin to run ahead of real reformist sentiment. It was in 1780, during the American War, that English radicals adopted a platform of demands which would remain unsatisfied until the middle of the next century, like universal adult male suffrage and the redistribution of parliamentary seats according to population. Perhaps indeed liberal sentiments were more widely found among the educated classes in 1780 than a decade later. The most public overt agency of reform in the period, the lobbying, petitioning, political association, was not much in evidence in the 1780s. The important groups had to be founded or refounded early in the next decade. Instead, the most coherent group among the reformers, the rational dissenters, relied on the support of friendly liberal Whigs to bring up in Parliament their special cause, the repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts, the 17th century legislation which prevented non-Anglicans from holding public office. Bills which would have given them these civic rights were introduced and defeated in 1787, 1789, 1790, and 1791. But in the era of the American Revolution, the general case for reform had already been eloquently made by the two leading spokesmen for the dissenters, Richard Price, author of Observations on the Nature of Civil Liberty, the Principles of Government, and the Justice and Policy of the War with America, and Joseph Priestley, whose prolific works include an essay on the first principles of government. In intention, these two leading radicals have limited objectives and are hardly, by modern standards, Democrats. Priestley, for example, does not advocate any redistribution of property and certainly does not envisage handing over power to the masses, for he expects the enfranchised common man to choose an educated representative. Yet Priestley and other dissenting intellectuals are all along in a false position, cut off both from the governmental process and from meaningful political discussion with members of other social groups. The result is that during the 1780s and early 1790s, they and those like them evolve a rhetoric of liberty which is international rather than patriotic, quote, leveling, end quote, rather than hierarchical, and above all misleadingly unconstrained, since it puts its claims in respect of the individual conscience, which has no class accent. The message that comes across, unspecific yet unmistakable, is insubordination. A phrase like, quote, the sovereignty of the people, end quote, acquires almost indefinite implications, including, for Richard Price, the concept that the people can dismiss their monarch. The extremist tone of the dissenters' rhetoric may have helped to lose gentry and middle-class support for reform in 1792-5, if indeed widespread reformist sentiment was still there to lose. Extremism, out of step with the real sentiment in the country, is the main characteristic of this body of writing, perhaps insufficiently noticed because modern historians of these events are prone to discuss the class affiliations of the writers and their conscious intentions and their careful caveats rather than their subliminal impact. Fired by enthusiasm at events in France and by the too ready sympathy of a like-minded pre-selected circle of readers, the leading London radicals produced between 1791 and early 1793 a series of innovative and utopian proposals. Paine, Godwin, and Wollstonecraft envisaged, for example, the establishment of a humane welfare state, or the ultimate withering away of the centralized state, or a new egalitarianism in interpersonal relations which would do away with the employee's subservience to the employer or woman's to man. But these are the celebrated performances preserved for us perhaps by their extremism. The debate as it evolved after 1790 was often more humdrum or more practical. Most of the excerpts I have chosen originate as pamphlets published at prices varying from 1 penny, Thomas Spence's Meridian Sun of Liberty, to 3 shillings, Burke's Reflections. The price is an indicator of the public aimed at. A few came out in books in 1 volume or more, and costing at least £1, Wollstonecraft, Young, Godwin. Rather, more were not independently published, but contributions to journals or newspapers. The writers involved in the debate chose different ways to reach the public, or rather, in each case, a section of the public, defined by the price it would be willing to pay. A publishing industry with discriminating techniques of marketing already existed in London. A publishing industry with discriminating techniques of marketing already existed in London, and almost everything in the present selection emanated from London. It was largely run by dissenters, of whom 2 of the most influential were the Unitarian Joseph Johnson, publisher, bookseller, and owner-editor of the Analytical Review, and Ralph Griffiths, proprietor of the Monthly Review. The Monthly Review is one of the oldest, better-known left-wing presses and or journals in the United States. Now, not related to this one, but they have the same name. Though these were the 2 best reviews in 1791-3, their competitors, the Critical and the English, were also sympathetic to the dissenters and to the cause of reform. It became a matter of conservative comment, indeed scandal, that early in the decade, quote, informed opinion, end quote, was in the hands of a closely knit circle of which Johnson's dinner table in particular served a focus, since Johnson was the publisher, friend, and at times the host of Joseph Priestley, John Aiken, Anna Letitia Barbald, Joel Barlow, William Blake, Erasmus Darwin, R.L. and Maria Edgeworth, Henry Fuseli, William Wordsworth, Thomas Christie, William Godwin, Tom Paine, John Horne Tooke, Mary Wollstonecraft, Thomas Beddoes, and Humphrey Davy. The emergence of this group of interconnected radical intellectuals looked dangerous in a period when the political importance of, quote, public opinion, end quote, was becoming recognized. Even oligarchies cannot govern without a basis of support or acquiescence. The proliferation of comment in books and newspapers, much of it hostile, brought the extent of that support into question and made Pitt's administration nervous. By the early 19th century, it could be claimed that British governments might fall if the press turned against them. Though this state of affairs shocked many members of the administration and its supporters, who tended to think of radical journalists as irresponsible, ignorant, and scurrilous, the liberty of the press was also widely treasured in England, even by spokesmen for the upper orders, and perceived as a valuable element in the Constitution. It was the, quote, great palladium of British freedom, end quote. The great palladium. I don't know what that word means. Palladium. Quote, the great palladium of British freedom, end quote, essential to the nature of a free state, end quote. According to the constitutional lawyer Blackstone, while parliamentary liberal Whigs went further, quote, against despotism of any kind or in any shape, end quote, cried Sheridan in a celebrated speech, quote, let me but array a free press, and the liberties of England will stand unshaken, end quote. To its friends and its enemies, the press could be seen as a new fourth estate of the realm. A more cynical view of the real influence of opinion-mongering intellectuals in pre-reform England would be that they operated as a safety valve for the establishment. They might not often change government policy, but they gave an illusion of effectiveness to writers and readers, so that as a whole, this class failed to take up the option of organized political action. The view at the time, however, was that the more vociferous reformist writing was part of the political action, and it was upon this premise that the radicals and their antagonists in the government acted. The 12-month period beginning in February 1792 was the annus mirabilis of 18th century radicalism, for it saw not only the appearance of its classic texts, but the peak activity of radical associations in London and in the provinces, which were now, for the first time, not merely joined but run by working men. The London Society for Constitutional Information was, it is true, led by intellectuals. The SCI was John Horne Tooke's revival in 1790 of a society founded 10 years earlier by Major John Cartwright, R.B. Sheridan, Thomas Day, and others, quote, to revive the minds of their fellow citizens, the commonality at large, a knowledge of their lost rights, end quote. Occasionally in the provinces, educated men took the initiative while working men stood aloof. In Derby and Belport in 1792, the manufacturer William Strutt and the doctor Erasmus Darwin met opposition from workpeople when they attempted to distribute the Paynite propaganda sent them by the SCI. Much more commonly, gentlemen continued to meet in their literary and philosophical societies in order to debate revolution in its various aspects at a safely general level. For many modern historians, the most significant feature of the reform agitation of the 1790s is the spontaneous growth in London and in cities like Sheffield and Manchester of associations dominated by working men. Their point of contact in London, indeed the society, especially founded to provide the organizational link between radicals, was the London Corresponding Society, founded in January 1792 by the shoemaker Thomas Hardy, with unlimited membership and a subscription of a penny a week. As a political phenomenon, the LCS, with its discussions, its supports for radicals in the Midlands, the North, and Scotland, its links with the French National Convention, its mass meetings, was undoubtedly the single most important organization in the radical campaign. But the written word remained the other crucial weapon, one on which the popular societies were in the long run dependent. Here it was the SCI, which took the decisive step. A step which temporarily bonded the middle-class intellectuals to the mass movement when in May 1792 it determined to print as a pamphlet and distribute nationwide Tom Paine's Rights of Man. No other production of the pamphlet achieved the impact or notoriety of Paine's. While the London intellectuals were self-evidently addressing one another or similar members of the propertied classes in the provinces, they represented no threat to the established order. But the combination of rapidly spreading political organizations with a supply of eloquent radical writings to politicize the masses was another thing entirely. Late 1792 sees the buildup of the anti-Jacobin backlash, a largely spontaneous campaign to silence agitation and to ensure the loyalty of the common people. The gentry organized tenants into groups of yeomanry, a kind of home guard which could not have stood up to the French army, but imbibed sound patriotic principles along with its drills. A recently returned Chief Justice of Newfoundland, John Reeves, founded an association for preserving liberty and property against Republicans and levelers, which commissioned and then circulated a spate of popularly written pamphlets, religious loyalists, and soon far more numerous than radical reading matter aimed at the same audience. In the second half of 1792, Pitt's administration began its series of moves to stop the spread of radicalism through the written word. Paine left in September for France, but in December 1792, he was tried and sentenced in his absence for his authorship of a seditious libel, The Rights of Man. In court, the Attorney General made it clear that Paine's crime could not be estimated by considering his book as so many mere words on the page or as abstract ideas. Its being placed in the hands of the masses made it a political tool. The cheapness was an essential part of the offense. From this point, the government kept up a steady pressure against the popular side of radical publishing and regularly pulled in not so much the writers, but the publishers and distributors of Painite literature, such as the booksellers Simons, Eaton, and Spence in London, and Richard Phillips in Leicester, and the editor James Montgomery in Sheffield. By contrast, the intellectual leaders and writers remained for a while relatively safe because their role was perceived as in some sense gentlemanly and thus privileged, unlike that of the commercial booksellers or political organizers. Although the parliamentary Whigs, headed by Charles James Fox, and their association, the Friends of the People, were considered faint allies of the radicals of the LCS and SCI, they were of one mind and painfully and practically helpful on the principle of the free expression of opinion. In 1792, Fox got a libel act through Parliament, which ensured that the jury, not the judge, would be charged with determining whether or not a particular article amounted to libel. English juries over the next few years were to prove notably reluctant to find for the government, as they demonstrated when they threw out the charges of treason against the London radical leaders Hardy, Tooke, and Thelwall in November 1794. Scottish law left more to the judge, a difference which in 1793-4 sent 5 prominent middle-class radicals to Botany Bay for either 7 or 14 years. The parliamentary Whigs became a fully motivated opposition again in late 1795 when Pitt forced new repressive laws through Parliament. At this point, pamphleteers of the extra-parliamentary movement, like Godwin and Coleridge, seemed indistinguishable from aristocratic parliamentary Whigs like Fox and Sheridan. But by 1795, the freedom they were claiming was to express their minds as individuals, not as a group. The growing importance, the respectable consensual popularity of the issue of free expression must have worked to detach the leading writers from the reform movement in which they began. The dignity they perceived in writing increases in proportion to its intricacy and individuality and is compromised if the writing aims to express the views of a group. In fact, the uproar over Paine now looks like the crucial moment of the controversy, as decisive a turning point in the psychology of the radical intellectual as in general political opinion. Paine forced his friends and colleagues to see themselves for the first time as activists in, moreover, what was now a mass movement rather than a coterie or a middle-class, quote, interest, end quote. The rethinking which had to follow this development drove some prominent reformers like Mackintosh and Bishop Watson out of the radical camp and forced painful, protracted revisions on the more heavily committed, very well exemplified in the defensive strategies of Godwin. The shock and anxiety felt by intellectuals was all the greater because their prestige in the late 18th century had risen so extraordinarily high. Godwin's novel about a man subjected to witch hunting when he tries to tell the truth, Caleb Williams of 1794, expresses the fears of every critic of the system. Once he finds Paine being described by politicians, judges, churchmen, and fellow journalists as a fugitive and a criminal. Even without Paine, incendiarism and the backlash provoked by it, nothing could stop the ebbing of the radical tide once England began to move towards total war with France. These two most powerful European nations had been rivals and imminently at war for over a century. Once the French government was not merely revolutionary, but aggressively bent on exporting revolution, external pressure forced English opinion towards conservatism. Before war broke out during 1792, the French Revolution became much more radical. In November, the convention issued a decree of, quote, fraternity and assistance, end quote, to all peoples, threatening every conservative European government with a fifth column within the state. For the time being, many English radicals nevertheless tried to maintain their links with the convention in Paris. Paine, in his exile, became a deputy. After war was declared between France and England in 1793, fairly moderate members of the opposition in and out of Parliament believed it to be the ploy of an aggressive aristocratic English government against the peace-loving, humane, and united people of France. It was not altogether easy for English critics of Pitt's government to maintain a rosy view of the new French Republic. They had to contend with disconcerting news. The September massacres of 1792, the execution of the first king and then the queen in 1793, the terror of 1794, and the Royalist rebellion in the Vendée, not sure how to say that, Vendée with an accent E, of 1793-5. Some radicals and liberal Whigs saw the war to the end as England's, quote, fault, end quote. Godwin claimed that no one who had once favored the French deserted them. At least until 1797, the government across the Channel became unmistakably a military dictatorship, and French armies had marched into the Low Countries, Switzerland, and Italy. Insidiously, however, even the most stalwart radical was caught up in the powerful change of feeling which begins with the mass distribution of the rights of man. With the publication of Political Justice in February 1793, the month the war began, the heroic age of the expansion of radical thinking comes to an end. After this, the pamphlets drop away sharply in number, and the new ones are less innovatory. Rather than attempting new theories or new applications of old theories, they repeat familiar principles and make the kind of broad humanitarian points that are calculated to hold and reassure the right-minded reader. The years 1793 to 1796 see the emergence of John Thelwall, sentimental poet and novelist, journalist, lecturer, and orator, rather than original thinker, as a leading figure among the radicals. Many brave and risky efforts to both organize radicals and write for them occur in these post-Paine years. The political objective now is to abstract and hold the widest possible support for an anti-government platform. Activists no longer use the self-sustaining discourse of a closed clique of convinced reformers. We are judging from the viewpoint of professional intellectuals when we object that the journals and pamphlets that follow Paine, a more working-class phase of the movement, seem, if Thomas Spence is accepted, less innovatory and bold than the work of the middle-class reformers in the climactic years of 1792. Perhaps the most remarkable popularizer for the masses was Joseph Gales of Sheffield, a Unitary master printer and bookseller who ran two journals, the weekly Sheffield Register from 1787 and the fortnightly Patriot from 1792, both designed to disseminate radical opinion and information to a readership which would include working men. The Register cost only 1.5 pence for a weekly copy. The Patriot, which Albert Goodwin calls, quote, the most original and significant radical publication to issue from the provincial press, end quote, contained accounts of radical politics at home and of events in France and selections from classics of radical political theory, Locke, Bolingbroke, Montesquieu, Junius, Rousseau, David Williams, Obadiah Holm, Volney. In 1793, the Register became the Iris, under the editorship of Moravian James Montgomery, a minor poet and man of letters, and a literary patron and focus of intellectual life in Sheffield throughout the war. Other important newspapers in the Midlands and the North included the fiery radical Manchester Herald and the Methodist William Ward's Derby Mercury, and Richard Phillips' moderate Leicester Herald. Meanwhile, Norwich was rather a different case, a city with a flourishing literary life which included the neighboring gentry, but it was dominated by dissenters. Its cabinet, 1794-5, is an anonymous collective enterprise which shows that genteel radicals were still willing to emit libertarian principles in public, at least when they had the encouragement of a sympathetic audience. But thinking in the cabinet, though sometimes unselfishly critical of property, is not new, nor is it in the provincial lecturing and journalism of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who in 1796 tries with his Watchmen to reach the rational dissenting public of Bristol, the Midlands, and the Northwest. In the second half of the present book, intellectual radicalism can be observed going underground. The 1793 version of Godwin's Political Justice well exemplifies the early positive phase of radical writing, with its large horizons, optimism, extremism, and impracticality. In 1795, Godwin embarked on the first of two large-scale revisions of political justice, in the course of which he made significant alterations to the 1793 version. These are not, as legend has it, simple political retractions. In fact, Godwin now develops a more subtle, hostile, and profound account of how, quote, aristocracy, end quote, really functions, and he develops those passages which suggest how it victimizes its intelligent dissidents. Yet to make a book more subtle and individual is also perhaps to make the book appeal more specialized. Make the books appeal more specialized, and the new insistence upon a refined reader is further signaled when Godwin stresses that revolution will come first by means of enlightened thinking. In the preface to his next work, The Inquirer, 1797, a miscellany of essays on neutral subjects like education and an educated style, Godwin apologizes both for his early precipitancy over the French Revolution and for the ambitious, systematic format of political justice. His new book will be far more cautious. Its, quote, recurrence to experiment and actual observation, end quote, only a short excursion at a time, end quote, not dicta, but, quote, materials of thinking, end quote, together prove its humbler aspirations and its intended appeal to those committed to a life of thought rather than of action. Godwin did not show others how to retreat. It is one of the characteristics of a community that its members react similarly, though independently. By 1800, Godwin found himself a member of a reconstituted circle of radicals or ex-radicals, a more strictly literary, quote, literary London, end quote, which included Coleridge, James Lamb, William Hazlitt, George Dyer, and Joseph Cottle, and his thinking came to coincide with theirs. Quote, in my 44th year, I ceased to regard the name of atheist with the same complacency I had done for several preceding years. My theism, if such I may be permitted to call it, consists in a reverent and soothing contemplation of all that is beautiful, grand, or mysterious in the system of the universe. Into this train of thinking I was first led by the conversations of S.T. Coleridge. End quote. Godwin. Godwin's earlier work, now much more inflammatory than its author, continued to suggest to later radicals like Shelley that the intellectual might usefully aim for revolution in the minds of his readers, if not on the streets, in the taverns, or at the barricades. The tone of the circle after 1800 was better caught by Charles Lamb, who that year professed an inability to interest himself in the French Revolution at all. Quote, as to France and Frenchmen, an Abbé C.S. I don't know how to pronounce that person's name. I've seen it a million times, I think. A-B-B, E with an accent, space, S-I-E-Y, E with an accent, S, and his constitutions, I cannot make these present times present to me. End quote. Godwin. Oh, no, that's not Godwin. Charles Lamb. That quote's from Charles Lamb. The polarization of literature and politics around 1800, the writer's own developing insistence that these are two different kinds of interest, comes as an ironic ending to half a century in which the arts are impregnated with politics. In painting especially, the, quote, alternative, end quote, ideology expressed in so much directly political writing finds an expressive language and iconography. From the era of the American War, painters such as Barry, West, Moreland, Fuseli, Banks, and Blake are firmly identified with the radical camp. The poets who rise to prominence in the 1780s are headed by Cowper, Crabbe, Burns, and Blake once more, a pro-French and free-thinking strain common in some circles of pre-revolutionary aristocracy is reflected in long poems on esoteric but controversial subjects like Erasmus, Darwin's Botanic Garden, 1789-91, which portrays a universe governed by the sexual principle. Richard Payne Knight's The Landscape, 1794, which views landscape gardening with an egalitarian eye, and the same author's Progress of Society, 1796, a primitivist critique of its subject. By 1797, when George Canning and his friends found the anti-Jacobin, they are able to point to more middle-class styles of poetic subversion, which they evidently feel to be more of a threat than the long philosophical poem, the German sentimental drama, which is now all the theatrical rage, and the sentimental humanitarian ballad or sonnet of Southey, Coleridge, and their Bristol circle. The Anti-Jacobin Journal even acknowledges that most good new poetry is of this democratic kind, a case which would have more cogency if Canning had included Wordsworth's Salisbury Plain or Thelwall's miscellaneous verse and peripatetic of 1793, or extended his argument to prose to include Jacobin novels such as Charlotte Smith's Desmond, 1792, Robert Bage's Man as He Is, 1792, the Hermsprong, 1796, Holcroft's Anna St. Ives, 1792, and Hugh Trevor, 1794-7, Godwin's Caleb Williams, 1794, Elizabeth Ichbald's Nature and Art, 1796, Mary Hayes's Memoirs of Emma Courtney, 1796, Mary Wollstonecraft's Maria, or The Wrongs of Woman, 1798. The literary London of such writers no longer depended upon upper-class leadership and patronage. Painters and sculptors, like musicians, had a more problematic and potentially humiliating relationship to the wealthy, which is no doubt why Moreland, for one, tried to use go-betweens to market his work so that the buyers would have no direct say in subject matter or treatment. Engravers, on the other hand, shared many of the economic opportunities of writers who were able to reach out through the booksellers with their network of journals and libraries to an increasingly large and ill-defined middle-class public. Given the circumstances of production in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, it is no wonder if writers and artists' self-images begin to assume a new dignity, an insistence on sturdy independence of the wealthy and powerful. An insistence on the sturdy independence of the wealthy and powerful. The same confidence is expressed in works of scholarship, which also share the tendency of the arts and of journalism to convey oppositional opinion. Hume's Tory version of England's recent past is challenged by the Whig Catherine Macaulay, who ends her story triumphantly of the 1688 Revolution. In his historical view of the English government, 1787, the Scotsman John Millar gives a sweeping scientific account of the evolution of government, which lends historical sophistication and respectability to the sentimental primitivism beloved of radical polemicists, and that myth common to Cartwright, Priestley, and Paine that Anglo-Saxon liberties were lost under a Norman yoke. Burke's medievalist Catholic vision counters such values to be opposed in turn by a yet more aggressive version of popular history. Joseph Riston's claim that by using an oral form, the ballad, the people have kept a record distinct from that of their rulers and from monkish chroniclers. To claim that learned arguments may not be merely on the side of the people, but written for the people and by the people is of course to go further than to write Whiggish history. One of the most significant innovatory themes illustrated in this volume is the attempt to democratize language, to find a written style appropriate for the literate but not classically educated lower, middle, and upper working class. Some of the efforts to demystify learning were doomed to failure, like schemes by Ritson and Spence to simplify spelling. Others, like Tooke's attack on the obfuscation built into learned language by the self-interested upper orders, had a prolonged influence. But as a whole, the fate of these fundamentalist experiments depended upon the fate of radicalism, which means that in the short term they met defeat. When mass education got underway with the late 18th century Sunday school movement and the early 19th century national systems, it did without theories about popular poetry and alternative history. Wordsworth's preface to the lyrical ballads reiterates the case for the dignity of the language of simple, uneducated people, along with the truth and profundity of their experience. But these pages were singled out for attack by Coleridge and Jeffrey, critics relatively sympathetic to Wordsworth and to liberalism. Instead of providing a manifesto for 19th century literature, they marked the end of the 18th century dream of universal culture. The notion of a poetry, or prose or grammar, for the people was profoundly in conflict with the other theme emerging in ex-radical literary London, that literature should be guaranteed immunity from prosecution because, by definition, it did not threaten the state. The excerpts which follow here begin with a series of thumbnail sketches of intellectuals written by themselves. For Tooke, the writer is the brave, persistent challenger of authority. For Price, he is a wise enlightener. And for both, he belongs in a public tradition of nonconformity going back to the Civil War. But these self-idealizations, for that is what they are, come under increasingly fierce challenge. Burke, in Reflections, deprives his opponents of their history and puts them prosily behind the shop counter as economists, calculators, and tallow chandlers. In his Letter to a Noble Lord of 1796, Burke makes the radicals seem more dangerous than this, the same breed as the, quote, cannibal philosophers, end quote, of France. Get a swig here. Sweet, sweet swig. The campaign against radical intellectuals grows greatly in volume in the second half of the decade, and it is fought in newspapers and journals, in the cartoons of Gilray, and in scores of, quote, anti-Jacobin, end quote, satirical novels. Thelwall is at last driven out of politics, though not before he has replied to Burke with a glowing defense of enlightened intellectuals in general and of himself in particular. In October 1797, he writes a sad cradle poem to his baby son named John Hampden, after the Civil War patriot, who has been born into a, quote, wilderness of wrongs, end quote, where his father, quote, in his native land, wanders in exile, end quote. 4 months later, Thelwall's friend, Coleridge, writes his cradle poem, quote, entitled frost at midnight. To a baby son, named pointedly after a philosopher, Hartley, and destined, his father hopes, to a calm life lived at one with nature and receptive to God's eternal language. Coleridge's poetic subjects over the next few years include nature and religion, the inner life, friendship, and home. Gradually, he turns in his prose to abstruser subjects, philosophy and theology, to produce eventually a sophisticated theory of literature which associates literature with a pious and responsible class, the, quote, clerisy, end quote. Wordsworth remains for the time being more ambivalent, at his most radical in the version of the preface to the lyrical ballads that appeared in 1802, but already a philosophical poet in the Coleridgean sense in The Borderers, 1796-7, and the great series of poems, including the Prelude, in which, before the turn of the century, he ponders the experiences of recluses and private men. In the years 1798-9, Joseph Johnson, doyen of publishers, spent 9 months in jail for selling Gilbert Wakefield's anti-war pamphlet, while Wakefield himself, an elderly dissenting minister and classical scholar, received a 2-year sentence from which he emerged a dying man. The pamphlet does indeed seem actionable by modern conventions of war, but 18th century England had no tradition of wartime censorship in the national interest. The government's treatment of Johnson and Wakefield was taken to be unprecedented aggression, the end of the truce against scholars, with no defense except pure motives and a small readership. Fox at the time considered the case, quote, a death blow to the liberty of the press, end quote. Wordsworth remembered Wakefield nervously a decade later, while he was preparing his hardly disloyal pamphlet on the Convention of Sintra. In their demoralization, it is not surprising that literary men began to emphasize their intention to be of good behavior and keep the peace. The new literary dispensation, after about 1800, put serious difficulties in the way of the critic who approaches the prose of the 1790s. In theory, it is not hard to specify a suitable method for criticizing political rhetoric. Polemicists are in the business of selling something, so that approaching them intelligently means approaching them skeptically. Do they claim to be discussing principles rather than their own material advantage? Do they describe themselves as moderates or as disinterested bystanders? The more dignified the posture, the sonorous the rhetoric, enhancing the ideals, the more persuasive a writer is likely to be. We should not be gullible any more than when seeing an advertisement or listening to a politician. Analyzing polemical prose will include identifying the author's self-characterization, sane, tolerant, public-spirited, harmless, and noting his devices, such as Burke's emotive imagery or Paine's vulgarism, and then considering how the persona and the devices function on behalf of his chosen cause. In practice, our approach to political prose is bedeviled because we are ourselves romantics or post-romantics. We have been taught the primarily aesthetic values adopted by literary men from their political defeat. So we tend to ask questions which already prejudge the issue by smuggling in aesthetic and individualistic values, such as, quote, who wrote the best prose, end quote, or, quote, which are the masterpieces, end quote. If these are really the right questions, the answers follow without much room for dispute. Burke is the preeminent prose writer of the decade, for he has a range, inventiveness, wit, and personal feeling which no one else matches. Burke makes a highly subtle appeal, using the stick and the carrot. On the one hand, he frightens the reader with a prospect of social breakdown and with biblical tones reminiscent of paternal authority, while on the other he coddles him into loyalty with reminders of home and of tightly drawn family. By the end of the century, with European societies destabilized and Burke's fears apparently realized, these themes and rhythms seem to enter into the prose and verse of many imaginative writers, notably of Wordsworth and Coleridge. Though no match for Burke in skill, Godwin, among the Revolution debaters proper, is sensitive to some of the same insecurities. To single out these two is, however, to concur with the position being reached in 1800 that good writing should be about personal experience, not public problems. It is to reject the, quote, alternative, end quote, tradition, which the reader of this book will also find advocated, the radical goal of communicating with a wider audience in a common language, the, quote, highbrow, end quote, specialist discourse of the educated classes, in which Godwin and Coleridge not only wrote, but gradually helped to define and defend, was challenged in the period by an idealized concept of the vernacular which could be a suitable medium for intellectual debate and even for art. Here it is the two writers returning to England with American experience, Paine and Cobbett, who use popular vocabulary and rhythms and draw on popular suspicion of rulers and thus pragmatically establish that politics is the people's business. No contemporary prose writer matches these two in their capacity to make a simple, uncluttered point. Their only challenger, Spence, never achieves their command of language and succeeds, when he succeeds, with the boldness of his radical vision. For this group of writers, the prose pamphlet was related to the newspaper, and the criterion of excellence was not to stimulate the reader's introversion, not to address his private fears, but to encourage notions large enough and common enough to become a basis for collective political action. In the search for a plain, comprehensible style, the defeat of radicalism in the mid-1790s was a setback, but it was temporary. By the 1800s, Cobbett was taking up the natural position of the political journalist in unreformed England, that of a spokesman for the extra-parliamentary opposition. When the next radical opportunity came in 1816, Cobbett did with his political register, which I guess is a journal, it's in italics, what had been done with Paine's Rights of Man. Maybe it's a book. I don't know. In 1792, he sold it direct to the mass public at 2 pence a time. Where the after-history of poetry is ultimately that of the private theme and the small, highly educated audience, in prose the experiences of the 1790s set a pattern for the future.